Nvidia has officially released their 16GB RTX 4060 Ti, and I'm going to tell you exactly why you should avoid this card at all costs. Welcome everyone to Gamer Meld. When Nvidia initially announced that their RTX 4060 Ti was coming with 8GB of VRAM, everyone was disappointed to say the least. But they also announced a 16GB variant. The issue is that that model is a whopping $100 more than the regular 4060 Ti. To make matters worse, unlike the RTX 3060, which also has two different versions, 12GB and 8GB, these actually had two different memory bus widths, one at 192 and one at 128. Yet that is not the case for the 4060 Ti. You can see here 16GB of GDDR6 or 8GB model, but everything else is exactly the same, and that includes the measly 128-bit bus. Oh, and speaking of Nvidia launching two different RTX 4060 Ti's, what exactly happened to that whole unlaunching of the 4080? Remember, the entire reason Nvidia did this, supposedly, was because having two GPUs with the 4080 designation is confusing. Ooh, you must kind of be confused yourself. It's only confusing when it's the 4080, but when it's the 4060, it's completely fine. And of course, all of this, as I said in my intro, is to say that the 4060 Ti's 16GB model is officially here. Now, that may actually be a surprise to you, because if you remember a little while back, I discussed the fact that Nvidia was potentially not planning on seeding the RTX 4060 Ti 16GB model for reviews, meaning them as well as AIBs weren't really wanting to send out cards to get reviews. So it's almost like Nvidia themselves hate their own new GPU. And believe it or not, it's actually even worse. But first, if you like to stay up to date on PC hardware releases, make sure you join Meld Alerts at meldalerts.com, the completely free newsletter where you learn about new PC hardware releases like CPUs, GPUs, all that good stuff, as well as PC hardware deals. And don't worry, I won't spam your email or anything like that, so there's no reason not to join. All you need is your email and that's it. Sign up at meldalerts.com. Once again, that's meldalerts.com. Now back to the video. When we look down here from Tech Power Up, you can see that they state to prevent reviewers who could somehow score cards in partnership with retailers, Nvidia ensured that there were no drivers available until the day of launch. As they say, without drivers, there's no way for anyone to test the card. And yeah, it does show because there's literally 0 reviews anywhere. Now, you may be wondering why in the world I can give my opinion on this, even though I don't actually have a card myself, and that's because I'd argue we actually have enough information from multiple sources that effectively gives us a very good reason why you shouldn't buy this card. For starters, when Nvidia initially announced these GPUs, they actually shared benchmarks for both of them. And given we already have the 8GB RTX 4060 Ti, we can actually do some really good comparisons here. For starters, I think it's nice to look at what differs between these two benchmarks, or these two ones shared by Nvidia. And of course, these will likely be some of the best case scenarios, but regardless, there's a lot of games here, and I think it really tells us something pretty important. As you can see right here, this is actually a comparison between the two and the differences. The darker green is the 16GB 4060 Ti, and as you can see, it's essentially the same across the board, except for 2 games. Now, you may also be a little bit confused at first, which I actually was. Why in the world are there differences between the 3060 Ti and 2060 Super? It's not like they're adding more VRAM to those cards or anything like that. No, what it actually is, when we look at the 4060 Ti 16GB, you can see here that it's 1080p max settings, DLSS, all that stuff. I'll actually talk about that as well, but 1080p max settings, but the 8GB 1080p max settings except these 2 games. And coincidentally, it's these 2 games where the 3060 Ti and 2060 Super also differ. So basically they had different settings. Now you might be thinking, oh, well, if they have different settings, how can we compare the 8GB to the 16GB model? And that's because, well, for one, really quickly, when we look, the difference, you can see that the 8GB model, which it has essentially lower settings on these two. We can see that we have a Plague Tale Requiem right here is actually faster than the 16 gigabyte model. And that's because it actually uses higher settings for that. So these lower scores are technically for the 16 gigabyte model. I know it kind of gets a little bit confusing here, but the important part is really right here. The 16 gigabyte model for, let me actually find it again right here. We can see that the 16 gigabyte model does in fact go down as well. Now you might be thinking, what? The 16 gigabyte model is technically worse than the 8 gigabyte model? No. What almost certainly happened is that in these two games, when they did max settings for the 8 gigabyte model, it likely tanked in performance, like just horribly tanked. So technically, the 16 gigabyte model will have done much better. It probably would have done significantly better in with these exact same settings as well. And while it does look like it goes down, I guarantee you it does not go down any more than the 8 gigabyte model. Basically, what the 16 gigabyte model is going to be good at are in those few games where 8 gigabytes simply isn't enough. Now, you may argue that as more and more games keep coming out, 8 gigabytes will become more and more of an issue. And I definitely agree with that. But at $500, this really is not a great GPU. Simply put, you're paying $100 more for right now, where only a few games in fairly specific scenarios are you really going to see much of a difference at all. Yes, it will get worse as time goes on, but when we actually look right here, I would argue that it really is not worth it at $500. As you can see right here, the 4060 Ti 82.9 versus the 4070 104.5. I believe that was something around 25% faster. And you might be thinking, oh, 25% faster. The price difference between the 4060 Ti 16 gigabyte model and 4070 is around 20%. It's $100 more for that 4070. The issue is that this is only at 1080p. And I'd argue here that the CPU ends up being the main bottleneck for the 4070 at 1080p, because when we move over to 1440p, we can see that the difference changes drastically. Oh, and this is a 15 game average overall between rasterization as well as ray tracing. So I think it really gives you a good idea when comparing multiple GPUs. Either way, it's over 30% of a difference here, and then it gets even worse at 4K. We can see that when comparing the 4060 Ti to the 4070, it's nearly a 50% increase in performance. And of course, we are talking about the 16 gigabyte model, but don't forget just how similar those GPUs are. Even down in just regular rasterization, we see going through each game, it's not like it's getting massive drops in these games. You can see that the 4070 is still completely crushing it. Basically, the RTX 4070 is a massive jump in performance when compared to the 4060 Ti. And don't forget that the only time that the 16 gigabyte 4060 Ti is going to do better than the 8 gigabyte model is in those few situations where 8 gigabytes simply isn't enough. And I definitely argue that that's almost certainly why Nvidia and board partners did not feel comfortable sending out review units. They're basically saying, hey, this GPU is $100 more, yet when you go and review the games, it's essentially the same in the vast majority of those. So even where the 8 gigabytes isn't enough, once you put the 16 gigabyte model, don't forget it's exactly the same as the 8 gigabyte model, you're still going to see this massive gulf between the 16 gigabyte 4060 Ti and the 4070. Now, you may want to argue, oh, the 4070 only has 12 gigabytes of VRAM, while the 4060 Ti has 16. And yes, that is true, but don't forget that it is still 12, and the memory bus is wider for the 4070. But it actually doesn't end there. Well, really quickly, I'll just show you that the 4070 is $100 more than the 16 gigabyte 4060 Ti, but I'm trying to argue that it's only a 20% increase in price, yet a massive increase in performance. But I actually have one that's even better. As you can see here, the 6800 XT is just over $500, so it's right at the exact same price of that 16 gigabyte 4060 Ti, and yet, unlike the 4070, The 6800 XT does have 16 gigabytes of VRAM. And when we compare these GPUs, we can now, they don't really compare it with the 6800 XT, but they do compare it with the non-XT model, which is even worse. Yet overall, the non-XT model still beats the 4060 Ti overall. Now, it significantly, if I can get to it, significantly does better at rasterization, and it's essentially right at the exact same in ray tracing. So this is definitely a much better buy, and don't forget, once again, this is the non-XT model. So the XT model will be even faster than this, or if you're really stuck on the $500 price, non-XT models are selling for quite a bit cheaper than that. So this is a way better buy, period. End of sentence. I can essentially definitively say that, unless something in there is like magical, but we pretty well know it isn't, because that's why Nvidia didn't send out review units. Oh, and don't forget, with AMD cards, it actually comes with Starfield for free. Basically, at the end of the day, you really do not want to buy the 4060 Ti. It doesn't matter if reviews are out there or not, do not buy it. So while that does it for today, I do hope you liked the video. I know it's different from my usual one, but there wasn't a lot of news out, and this was really something that I wanted to discuss. Regardless, if you did like it, please make sure to subscribe and give it a thumbs up. And as always, have a great day.